Vatican City, the Nexus city in Rome, in Italy, a city within a city. And as we look at St. Peters Basilica, an example of Renaissance architecture, in the middle of Rome, in the middle of the Vatican, as its primary edifice, we're looking at the largest church in the world. We're looking at the church with the largest area and the largest capacity. There's nothing else that even comes close to this incredible edifice. The seat of the Holy See is what the Vatican is. Yet this is a city that's a nexus of so many different things. A nexus of histories from the mainstream account. A nexus of cultures and societies. Everything exists within the Vatican. And yet it's a very small area. We have many aspects of the Roman Empire that are integrated within Rome and around the Vatican. And that's what we mean when we talk about it being a nexus of empires and civilizations. Come join me as we begin our exploration of the Vatican, explaining the mystery of the Nexus City. Welcome. The area of the Vatican is extremely constrained. When you consider the vast size of St. Peters Basilica, the actual area of the Vatican is much smaller than the average family farm in the United States. Just over 100 acres. Not quite 2/10 of a square mile. And we even have a geometrically precise foundation structure, or GPFS, instead of the classic name that we use. There are many different accounts of the Vatican, many cross-sections of what it really looks like. Yet looking at the space of it, it's incredible that they're able to fit so many structures. And yet the Vatican, as an independent city-state within Rome, has a population just over 760. You also have accounts of St. Peter's Basilica, or the Basilica of St. Peter's, as being the burial site of St. Peter, one of Jesus' chief apostles. There's cross-sections of the catacombs that exist under St. Peter's, and numerous well-documented maps. Of course, we come across that statement a lot of times, what well-documented really means. And what does well-documented means? It means that there are many records, written records and maps. And do we trust the veracity of those written records? Well, if we do, we may be correct, or we may be incorrect. It's all we have to go on. You can see, though, that with the geometrically precise foundation structure, Castle St. Angelo, or the Mausoleum of Hadrien as it was originally known, is not actually part of the Vatican. However, it's within the same area. And looking at the Vatican, we can see that they have compressed many buildings around St. Peter's Basilica and the entire organization of the Catholic Church. It's also intriguing to consider the history of the Vatican in the fact that it was originally just a small swampland as part of the old city of Rome that eventually rose to its chief paramount position as the head of the Catholic Church. And looking at this aerial imagery of St. Peter's, you can see it almost looks like a machine. And once again, we have geometrically precise foundation structures. Very intriguing. A lot of our historical documentation revolves around paintings and drawings. And people will say, why do you call these pictures? Well, because technically there are pictures. What you're looking at right now is a picture as well. One's a photograph, one's a drawing, one's a painting, but they're all technically pictures. And yet we need to question every single one. They may be completely accurate, or they may be inaccurate. There are many mysteries that revolve around the Vatican, this impressive city-state that exists in the middle of one of the greatest and oldest cities in the world. And St. Peter's being the largest and most impressive church in the world, especially from the Catholic Church perspective. Yet there's an interesting historical account about the fact that this architecture was the first new architecture in the city of Rome since the old Roman Empire. In other words, they tell us that the Romans fell apart and disintegrated. They didn't build buildings and bridges and all their other great infrastructural achievements anymore. And it wasn't until the Renaissance, a period of new learning in Europe centered around Italy, that happened in the 15 to the 1600s, and we'll omit the use of centuries because that just gets confusing as it's intended to do. And because of this new period of learning, this new period of cultural infusion, they were able to pick up these great building techniques again, these wonderful masters of Renaissance. And of course, it's considered a great compliment to be considered a Renaissance person from this time frame. You are someone who is of great learning. It's incredible to think that in an area that's not even 1/5 of a square mile, that all these different structures and all these different integrations and intersections of society and culture exist. The other intriguing thing is that if we consider the fact that our true recorded history that we can rely on a little bit more starts in the 19th century, as alternative researchers suggest, that the papal states, in other words, the Pope or the Bishop of Rome, which was the original hierarchical organization of the Catholic Church, they actually had their own lands that were in the center of Italy. And these lands were seized by the Italian government at the time, or the King of Italy in the 19th century. And that seemed to be the status quo. And they respected the territorial integrity of this Vatican City state until it was recognized in a treaty in 1929. A treaty that was presented by this gentleman in Italy, you may have heard of him, known as Benito Mussolini. After this, it's operated as its own independent city-state. An impressive series of buildings and structures and a complete overlap and intersection of society, culture, and knowledge, all in one very small area that just happens to have the largest church in the world located within it, and an infinite amount of records, and yet only 700 people. When we look across at some of the older records of the Vatican, at least the pictorial records, and of course I mean actual images that are shot with camera, we can see that there's been little change. We see the structures that we've seen in our other explorations, the great pediments, the columns and domes, and this isn't surprising here because this is Rome, and of course they had a lot of time, and they had the geniuses of the Renaissance. There's also a map that you can navigate that'll really show you how complicated the layout of the Vatican is, and it is very impressive, such as the unique gate here. There's also unique architecture within every single building and every single structure. Most of the buildings in the Vatican were reputed to have been constructed during the Renaissance era, or, in simple terms, the 15 to the 1600s. Here's the Holy Office, where we see the greatest authorities of the Church in Rome operate. And even on the side of this building, you can see some of the architectural stylings that we've seen. And, of course, the Apostolic Library, or the Vatican Library. And looking on the outside of these buildings, there's an entirely different story when you look at the interior. Here's the courtyard of the library, and you can see that it's deceptive. There's a lot more space and area on the interior than one would think, even in such a compressed area as Vatican City. And here you have the papal residence, where the Pope resides. Very interesting and intricate tower next to it, and every single window having the pediment over it, it appears. And then the Sistine Chapel. And everyone's heard of the Sistine Chapel, but this is where it's actually located in relation to St. Peter's. A very incredible, complex, and compilation of buildings in a very small area, and yet precise geometric patterns that we have many other names and references for, and yet you see this in the Vatican. The four gates. Everywhere you look. And yet, once again, there's interesting anomalies, such as that small sphere that we'll take a closer look at, located within the Vatican. The Tower of Nicholas V, referring to the earlier tower that we looked at. It's also an interesting consideration when we think of the layout of this city during the Renaissance period, in terms of how they managed to construct all these buildings and lay out this very complex and intricate series of structures. Without a doubt, it's safe to say that the Vatican is one of the most complicated compounds in the world. Yet there is no shortage of unique art depicting some sort of struggle that occurred in the distant past. And many will say that it's simply the warnings that come from the Catholic Church if you don't abide by your proper spiritual health. The interiors of the Vatican are where the true story is to be found, where you see some of the most beautiful and elaborate interior structures that you could ever imagine. Yet when you look at the outside, you see what appears to be an interesting juxtaposition of architectural stylings. Rome wasn't exactly known for its domes outside of the Pantheon, and yet we find some of the most elaborate domes that were constructed during the Renaissance period, by Michelangelo no less. When you also look at the entrance of the Vatican Museum, you see the juxtaposition of styles and that odd sphere within a sphere. Very unique. And very unique that such a sphere would be placed in a series of what we would consider classic old world buildings. What's the real purpose behind this sphere? What do you think this represents? And why are we focusing on this sphere? Because this is something that really stands out. It's a visual anomaly within everything else that we see within the Vatican. Why was this sphere approved to be placed here? Was it just a work of art? We also have the history of the Vatican during World War II, and we're told that the Pope wanted to keep the Vatican and Rome as neutral as possible to save the area from bombing. And there's no doubt that there was some very destructive bombing campaigns that occurred during World War II. And here, looking at the great courtyard in front of St. Peter's Square, where you can fit tens of thousands of people. We look at the entrance of the Vatican Museum, and now we consider the Vatican Museum a grand door and considered to be one of the most impressive museums in the world. And why not? It has a classic spiral staircase. And if you study monasteries and abbeys, you'll notice that the spiral staircase seems to be something that's repeated many times in this architectural styling. These complexities of access to a building. Something that shows us a time long past in terms of how we could lay out buildings. Yet we don't see spiral staircases favored in modern architecture. And the interior of the museum, and get used to these images because this is exactly what you're going to see as we look in the interior of all these buildings across the Vatican. Beautiful art, columns, arches, floors. And if you go to the Vatican in person, one thing you'll find yourself almost in a personal crisis about is how can such immense beauty exist in such a small area? And it is impressive how it's all fit together. The interior of all these buildings and the complex layouts almost reflects some sort of society that's more advanced and more difficult to explain. And the story of the Vatican Obelisk. This originally was an obelisk that existed in Egypt in the distant past. And under the orders of a Roman emperor, it was brought to Rome on a ship because apparently it was very easy to bring an entire obelisk on a ship across the Mediterranean in the distant past. Well, the Pope in the early Renaissance period, 14 to 1500s, didn't really care for the location of the obelisk and wanted it moved to a position in front of St. Peter's. And that's old St. Peter's. This is just a drawing of it because obviously we have no pictures as photography hadn't been invented during the Renaissance time yet. And we have this account of how this obelisk was originally brought over during Roman times across the Mediterranean Sea, and then how it was moved, albeit very difficultly, from one position to another in Rome. Interesting that this obelisk, and there are many obelisks you'll find across the greater city of Rome. Some are stated to be Egyptian obelisks that they brought over from the Mediterranean, and others are obelisks that the Romans themselves supposedly constructed. It's an intriguing account, though, and how much effort really went into moving this. And they do have it well documented, if you consider a painting of something being well documented. And this obelisk is the centerpiece of the courtyard, where you can see thousands or even tens of thousands of people gathered around during papal ceremonies. Very interesting layout of geometrical precision that still endures to this day with this obelisk. You'd almost have the impression that it was there much longer than what we're told. And what do obelisks really represent? What do they really mean? Do they simply represent a reference of the Holy Church in Rome recognizing the greatness of Egyptian civilization? Interestingly enough, there are no hieroglyphics on this particular obelisk, although if you look at other obelisks across Rome, you will find hieroglyphics on them. So it's hard to say what's really going on. Yes, we have our well-documented official historical account, and I suppose when we have numerous inconsistencies, we're just supposed to accept it. But I'm not one who simply accepts explanations simply, especially when there's contradictions. Now let's take a look at the Sistine Chapel. You've no doubt heard about the beauty of the Sistine Chapel. And it's not so much for its incredible structure or architecture, although it is impressive. It's for the paintings that were reputed to have been done by Michelangelo. And indeed, the official historical account says that Michelangelo worked tirelessly on all these paintings. It took him 4 years to paint the interior of the Sistine Chapel. The interesting thing is when you look into the achievements of Michelangelo, most people think of him as a sculptor. Painting was not his forte, and yet he did one of the most famous frescoes in the world, seen right here in the Sistine Chapel. We have a historical account that talks about some of the political maneuvering and personal feelings that caused this situation to happen. And yet Michelangelo became, well, you could really say he was one of the essential individuals from the 1500s to really take part not just in the painting of this incredible fresco in the Sistine Chapel, but also he was an architect in his spare time. And indeed, his architectural designs were factored into St. Peter's. Talk about a true Renaissance person. I wonder if he was spending all his time painting, which we're told it took him 4 years to achieve these incredible paintings in the Sistine Chapel, how did he keep up on his architectural prowess? And it's very difficult to find exactly who he studied under, but we could just say that maybe that wasn't so well documented. And that's understandable. Was he reading Architectural Weekly's Digest of the Renaissance Man in the 1500s? And as he was busy painting every single day, the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, he managed to keep up on his architectural capabilities. It's very impressive. And there was a movement in art called Mannerism that tried to replicate the very lifelike renderings of Michelangelo. And obviously, you won't see something like this today. And this is potentially how he worked for 4 years, on his back, laboring away on these incredible paintings, these incredible depictions in the Sistine Chapel. And you can see that there are other aspects to the Sistine Chapel. Again, the impressive architecture, and of course we recognize that design in the floor, which should be quite familiar to us by now. If you ever go to the Vatican and you see the Sistine Chapel, you'll find yourself completely overwhelmed by just the amount of artistic inspiration when you see it in person. And this is probably one of the most famous paintings, or at least one of the figures, or two of the figures, representing creation. And there's so many other aspects to it. Well, let's take a look at the Basilica of St. Peter, continuing on with the trappings of Michelangelo. Now, we're told that the original Basilica of St. Peter was eroding and rotting in the late 1400s, and the Pope desired to construct a new St. Peter's. Now, there were 4 architects that were supposedly involved in this, and the most famous being Michelangelo. He was brought on board, and he was late in his life, and he was the one who designed the dome. And even though he passed away in the mid-1500s and the actual St. Peter's Basilica was not finished until the early 1600s, his design was just that good that they were able to complete it. And indeed, there is no church since then that's ever matched this church, this basilica. And it should be noted it's not a cathedral, as it's technically not a residence of a bishop, which is the supposed Catholic definition of a cathedral. Yet, by far and away, this is the largest church in the world in terms of interior area and capacity. The layout on it is very impressive, and when you look at it in aerial imagery from above, it almost looks as though it's some sort of gigantic machine. And perhaps it does serve as some sort of machine. You can see how people would be completely awed by the wonder of divine inspiration when they gaze upon this edifice. Looking on its many domes, although it was supposed to have more domes, and there's only 2 subsidiary domes with the main dome when you look at it from above, so it's hard to say what exactly was going on. And it's explained by the fact that there were 4 architects involved in the design of St. Peter's. A very impressive architectural and construction achievement from the 1500s to the 1600s. And while they say it took 120 years to build, that's still an impressive timeline. Here are some of the other designs that we can look at when we consider St. Peter's. The interesting thing about this particular design, though, is that we can see that one of the other architects had a slightly different rendering or concept for it. Indeed, you can even get some of the ideas as to how it looked like a state capitol when it was originally designed. And perhaps that might be blasphemous to say or suggest, but, when it looks like something, it looks like something. And I always asked the question when I studied this originally in my history course, and then when I taught this, how exactly was the church so uncertain and indecisive about exactly what it wanted for its design? And yet you can see there were other designs submitted that showed wondrous architectural achievement and prowess. And one of the questions I asked that would get myself in trouble was, how exactly were they able to pick up the designs in the Renaissance so easily? The sketch of the dome is very intriguing in and of itself because it's supposed to give us an idea of the cross-section, and yet it's interesting to consider that domes aren't favored today. We have these very unique and lifelike statues that are also situated within St. Peter's, and every single one of them seems to represent the divine inspiration of the church, and also the belief in Jesus and the apostles. And you can see why this incredible edifice with these wondrous lifelike statues could certainly induce and incite such beliefs within people. When you gaze upon these statues in person, you're always left with a question that was from the movie Gladiator. I didn't know that men could build such things. And I'll admit that's a feeling that I had when I actually walked around the Vatican, and not just within St. Peter's, but in every aspect of it. Now that is a big door. What exactly is the purpose behind such a big door? Well, we just stated. It's to give you that feeling of awe-inspiring as you go into the church. And these are the bronze doors, and of course it's flanked by a couple columns. And once again you have a pediment with a picture on it. There is nothing that is spared within this church, and of course it makes sense as this is indeed the capital of the Roman Church across the lands. And looking up in the dome, and you can see that there are the same architectural stylings that we would see in the so-called neoclassical period. Because how do we explain that these architectural achievements were spread across the land? Well, simple. There were the predecessors of archaeologists, indeed the foremost archaeologists from Europe, who looked at these buildings in Rome and Greece, and then everybody wanted to build buildings like this across the land. And apparently it was as easy as just looking at them, and apparently the records were also stored for hundreds, if not over 1,000 years, and the Renaissance people were able to pick them up and very easily design and build these structures. Even over 100 years, this is the most impressive church in the world, and when you walk in it, you'll just be completely blown away by the size and magnitude, the large cavern quality of the entire church. You completely forget about the fact that you're in a patch of land that is less than 1/5 of a square mile. And look at this, even these vents are very decorative and almost otherworldly. This is supposedly a ventilation system to the catacombs beneath. And then, of course, you see the large decorations across the entire church. The way the light flows into St. Peter's is something that's very difficult to describe. Well, now we look at the Vatican Gallery of Maps. And this is yet another incredible artistic and architectural achievement within the Vatican. The Gallery of Maps, which depicts so many different maps mixed with art, that gives you an impression that there is true knowledge that is to be found within the Vatican. The layout of all these maps, they're not just the most accurate maps in the world at that time, they were also the most artistically inspired. And considering the many different depictions of the Vatican Gallery of Maps, and here we'll look at some of them, you can see that at that time this was supposed to be the most accurate and most artistically inspired maps available in the world. And even to this day, it seems as though it's difficult to find a comparison. Very incredibly ornate, and yet at the same time accurate. Almost disturbingly so, because when you go down this gallery of maps, you also see that it's surrounded by incredible architecture that mixes beauty with construction capability. And that's probably the most shocking thing about the Vatican, because even when you go in there knowing exactly what to expect, you'll find that everything about it continues to overwhelm you no matter how much you see. And you don't get over this process, this internal feeling of being overwhelmed, even though you're walking in an area that's barely over 100 acres. It's very astounding, and yet when you pay attention to some of the symbols, such as the sphere or some of these maps, you'll find some interesting clues that come out about what was really going on and what's really being depicted. Now you can certainly go back and look at these images, and I'll leave a link so you can look at a map of the Vatican yourself and interact exactly, if you're so inclined, with where each of these specific locations are within this little 0.2 square mile area. This hallway, though, feels like something that's, I can't even say it's out of a science fiction or a fantasy movie. This is something that completely defies imagination. And I remember having that same feeling when I walked in it. And of course, you'll see the usual depictions of purgatory, because remember, we are in the Vatican, and people need to be reminded that there is a purgatory. And of course, having a visual representation of it's a wonderful way to remind people there is a purgatory. There's something about the ceiling, though, within this hall that is difficult to describe in words, and I think it's just best to show it in pictures. Here we have the Battle of Lepanto, the great struggle between the Ottomans and the Holy League, led by Don John of Austria. This was supposedly a great Catholic victory in the distant past, and it prevented Ottoman control of the Mediterranean. We also have these other intricate maps that show the layout of the land, and what's most interesting to me, though, is how much emphasis is put on the waterways. And I suppose that makes sense, as that was the only means to travel at the time. But as you walk down this hallway of maps and you gaze on each of these maps in this very impressive hallway, you find that there's something that just reaches you on a deeper level about considering what kind of knowledge is being depicted on these maps. Where did they really come from? What was their actual origin? How is this hallway even constructed? And of course, those are questions that you're not supposed to ask because you're given very logical explanations for them. The logical explanation being is it was the Renaissance and learning had returned to Europe. And because learning had returned to Europe, people such as Michelangelo could be skilled at being sculptors, painters, and architects in their spare time, or perhaps the other expertise were in their spare time, and they managed to lay this out. Well, let's take a look at the Paul VI Audience Hall, the main papal audience hall. Now, this was built in 1971. Now, why are we looking at a newer building? Well, because it's on the Vatican residence area, or within the Vatican itself, and it has a rather peculiar look to it from the outside and on the inside. And it's one of those things that defies expectations in terms of what you'd expect to see in the Vatican. I'm not exactly sure what it looks like. My imagination is eluding me, and, we're not supposed to use our imaginations these days, so I'll just say that it looks like a peculiar building on the outside and on the inside. Now, supposedly it's on the roof of it. It has numerous solar panels that were provided by a German company, free of charge, of course, because making generous donations to the church is something that we'll see you rewarded for. Although I find it interesting that they say that the Kingdom of Italy seized a lot of the papal estates in the 19th century. Ah, yes. Very interesting sculpture that is supposed to depict our Lord and Savior coming out of the flames. Also a curious lack of crosses, but I'm sure they have their reasons. I don't know why, but when I look in the exterior, in the interior of this papal audience hall, I'm reminded of the movie Anaconda. Well, perhaps I just need to watch it again. Supposedly it can fit up to 6,300 people, and I'm often wondering if maybe they were 300 or so people short in terms of the overall capacity. Still, an impressive architectural achievement for the 1970s, and we can see that this was perhaps the Vatican's form of urban renewal in the 1960s and the 1970s. And very interesting, the entire layout of this audience hall, when you look at all the details, exactly where the supporting structures and the pillars are laid out, and just the overall layout of the ceiling. And I even appreciate the fact that the steps run right up to where you have the Pope flanked by the Swiss guards there. And of course that very interesting and unique sculpture in the background. This is definitely something that's supposed to convey the authority of the church, and not just the physical authority, but the spiritual authority. Perhaps the most accurate way to summarize this very intriguing audience hall is to say that it's really representative of the Vatican being a nexus of the past, the present, and the future. Very interesting window design. Once again, I really think I need to go see the movie Anaconda again. It's been so many years since I've seen it. Well, let's take a look at the Apostolic Library, the famous Vatican Library. And the layout of the library, along with the museum, bears a lot of striking architectural similarities and artistic decorations. There's so many things within this library, though, that we could ask questions about. The golden rows, the codices, the books, the manuscripts. Supposedly one of the most well laid out and high volume libraries in the world. And what kind of knowledge really exists within the Vatican? What do they have within their many manuscripts and books? Indeed, author Umberto Eco had access, supposedly, to the Vatican Library, and he was able to bring out a lot of knowledge and records from the distant past and incorporate them within several of his novels. You also see that it's not just a library in terms of how books are laid out, but it's yet another impressive architectural and artistic achievement. Yet many of the books and manuscripts that they have within the Vatican Library are from many different times and many different cultures and societies. So once again, the library itself exists as an edifice and a repository of the knowledge and achievements of human history. This is no doubt why many people see the Vatican Library as the greatest achievement of a library within the world. And even this bridge that leads to the Vatican is a bridge that was constructed during the Renaissance and was stated to be the first bridge constructed during the Roman times, well over 1,000 years earlier. Very interesting, and anyone who is a bibliophile or appreciates books imagines going through the Vatican collection, being able to look at the books. And this is Pope Sixtus VI, the one who is responsible for laying out and ordering the construction of this incredible library that exists to this day. You'll see the same kind of architectural stylings, and of course we can see in the painting back there the moving of the obelisk, which was quite a difficult process during the Renaissance and was also done on ship during Roman times. You can also find no shortage of collections of some of the manuscripts and the books within the library. And we all wonder what books are really available there, what kind of knowledge exists within this library. This is truly something that reaches our attention, and it seems to be something that's designed to get our attention, as well it should. Imagine such a library with such knowledge within it. And in our exploration last week, we considered old world libraries, and we consider the fact that this is probably one of the best, most superficial examples of a surviving library that connects the old world to the contemporary world. And once again, we see the familiar floor design and every single pillar having artistic layout. And of course, it wouldn't be a Vatican library without a depiction of hell, so we had our depiction of purgatory, and now we have our depiction of hell, just so you can get an idea of what it really looks like, because again, you need to visualize it. There's also other things that exist in the library. Old world maps, other layouts of maps, and this is beyond the gallery of maps that we looked at earlier, that you consider what exists within this library. All the different languages and all the knowledge of human achievements from the past, collected in one place. It definitely inspires the imagination, and that's why we'd all like to go to the library. We finish with the Mausoleum of Hadrien, or Castle Sant'Angelo, as it's known as today. A very intriguing Roman architectural achievement. At least that's what the official history will tell us. And here in this overhead imagery, we see the geometrically precise foundation structure, or GPFS as we call them now. Yes, I guess it kind of looks like a star. Looking at the structure, though, this is something that's supposedly well over 1,000 years old, almost 2,000 years old directly, and it seems to be holding up very well. There are numerous cross-sections of it, and we can certainly attribute these cross-sections to the works during the Renaissance. So a cross-section would be something you'd expect somebody to do when they're trying to learn about the construction of something after they've found a building. The interior of this mausoleum is very impressive. As you see, it's a combination of brickwork with Roman concrete at the time. So naturally, it would survive to 2,000. It'll probably survive to be 10,000 years old and will look just the same as it does now. Yes, I'm making a big assumption there, but what do you think? Let me know in the comments. Do you think that this mausoleum is going to look exactly the same, undisturbed, in another 8,000 years? It's interesting to think of the fact that this building and all these buildings in the Vatican made it through World War II, although we can attribute that to the Pope's neutral stance that neither of the factions in World War II targeted these buildings. There's also a lot of historical paintings that depict these buildings being laid out exactly as they are now. Now, of course, these are just paintings. Anybody could do a painting of anything. But you can still go and walk among these buildings today, and it should be noted that the Mausoleum of Hadrien is not technically part of the Vatican, but it is on the main entry road that runs right into the Basilica of St. Peter. You also see familiar figures, And we'll be told that these figures are added over time to give this mausoleum a more modern Roman Catholic appearance. And of course, the Archangel Michael and the other great angels that appear as part of the mausoleum. It's another one of those structures that is not easy to explain when you consider the fact that it shows the intersection of societies and civilizations over time. And yet it's no less impressive. And if you're ever walking the structure in person, you also get the idea of the differences of what are supposed to be intersecting timelines. When the bridge was built, when the different buildings in the Vatican were built, as opposed to these older buildings in Rome. It's not something that you can very easily reconcile within your mind, because what you'll find is these buildings look very similar. You'll also find that the construction materials seem to be of a similar age. Perhaps that's just a misperception. But when you look on the inside of these buildings, whether you're looking in the mausoleum or the basilica in St. Peter's, you'll find that the similarities seem to be overwhelming. You'll also find that when you look at the geometric precision of a lot of the layout of these buildings, it's not easy to conceptualize how someone could have designed this from the start, let alone how this was supposedly designed over different time frames with hundreds and in some cases 1,000 years between them of laying out all these buildings and all the interiors so precisely. Also the fact that they tell us that a lot of the buildings were built during Roman times, and yet most of the Vatican was supposedly constructed during the Renaissance. So that's how you explain the overall Vatican being a true intersection, a nexus point of different timelines, different societies, and different cultures. And even the mainstream account indicates that that's exactly the case. And when you go there and you see some of these old drawings of what supposedly existed in the distant past in Italy, and even after the Renaissance, it should be noted that there were many destructive conflicts that occurred across Europe. The 30 Years' War, which would mainly constitute the area of Germany that lasted in the 17th century, occurred after the Renaissance. We've seen these layouts before, though, looking back in the Mausoleum of Hadrien with all the bricks. And the view from the mausoleum is no less impressive. We haven't even started to explore the rest of Rome yet, but I thought the Vatican would be a wonderful starting point because if you think about it, it's really the linchpin that connects what used to be the Roman Empire to the Renaissance and to our current times. And yet when you actually explore it, when you go there in person or you look at the images, you have the perception that all of this existed together. So what to say in summary about the Vatican? If you go to the Vatican, you'll never believe that it's such a small area. You also find it difficult to reconcile the fact that there's only 700 residents. And you have the Swiss Guard, which is an independent military force which is assigned to protect the Pope and the other 700 people that live within the Vatican. You have a juxtaposition of old architecture, and yet you have strange anomalies such as the sphere and the papal auditorium or the papal audience hall, which shows you something different. And you also have this internal view of the Basilica of St. Peter, where you see the natural light and the way the natural light lights up these incredibly large open caverns. This is a place that if you visit, it will stay with you. It may be of spiritual divinity, or it may simply be by the perceptions of this incredible achievement of humanity. That may well be divinely inspired. Well, thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe. I hope you enjoyed this exploration.